All right, now that we've talked about solving absolute value equations, let's talk about going the other direction. Sometimes we'll be given the solutions and we'll be asked to write an equation. So whenever we are asked to write an absolute value equation, this is the format that our equation is going to take. X minus the midpoint is equal to the distance to the midpoint. So the midpoint is also going to be called, it's the mean or the average between our two solutions. And the distance to the midpoint is sometimes called the deviation. So you have an average and then you have a deviation from the average. So if we have a minimum point and a maximum point, we can call this A and this B. Our midpoint is just simply the average of A and B. So we would add A and B and divide by 2 because we have two numbers that we are trying to average. The distance between our minimum and our midpoint is the deviation, and the distance from the midpoint to the maximum is also that same deviation. That's the definition of a midpoint. Let's go ahead and try working one of these. We have a word problem here that in a cheerleading competition, the minimum length of a routine is 4 minutes. We'll call that our A value because that's our minimum. The maximum length is 5 minutes, so that's our B value. We want to write an absolute value equation, this should say and, that represents the minimum and maximum lengths. So again, we're going to have X minus the midpoint is equal to the distance to the midpoint. So if we know that we have a 4 here and a 5 here, we can find the midpoint as 4 plus 5 over 2. So our midpoint is 4 plus 5 over 2. And doing that little bit of math, I get 4.5. So that is our midpoint. The distance between 4 and 4.5 is 0.5. And the distance between 4.5 and 5 is also 0.5. Remember, distances are always positive. So that number is our distance to the midpoint. So we can write our equation based on this equation format as the absolute value of X minus our midpoint, which we calculated to be 4.5, and that has to be equal to the deviation of 0.5. Why don't you try the next problem and see if you can do that one on your own, and then come back here to check your work. All right, problem number 6. In a college application, the minimal accepted length of an essay is 375 words. We'll call that A. The maximum length is 425. We'll call that B. Write, I think that's fixed on your paper, but it wasn't on mine. Write an absolute value equation that represents the minimum and maximum number of words. So again, we're looking at our format of X minus the midpoint is equal to the distance to the midpoint. All right, so our smallest number is 375. Our biggest number is 425. So our midpoint is the average of those two numbers, 375 plus 425 over 2, and that's equal to exactly 400. So there is our midpoint at 400. Distance to the midpoint. If you take 400 and subtract 375, I get a distance of 25, and 425 minus 400 is also 25. Remember, if your midpoint doesn't actually end up being in the middle, in other words, if your deviations are not exactly the same, go back and check your work. You've made a math error somewhere. All right, keeping with our format, I have X minus my midpoint of 400 is equal to 25, my deviation or distance to the midpoint. Occasionally, you'll get an absolute value that just states solutions. It's not part of a word problem. It's just straight up gives you solutions. If that's the case, we're going to do the same exact thing. We're going to identify our smallest point and our largest point. So this is my A and my B. We're going to calculate a midpoint to be halfway in between those 2 points, which would be 5.5, excuse me. 5.5, and that is our midpoint. We again can figure out the distance between 5.5 and 2 as 3.5, and the distance between 9 and 5.5 as 3.5. So using our format of the absolute value of x minus the midpoint is equal to the distance to the midpoint, I have x minus 5.5 is equal to 3.5.